welcome to Talk Tuesday today. Today we're going to be talking all about the brain and more importantly, sort of our brain on the pandemic. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Heather Kingston. I'm high school head of English. I've been teaching for over 20 years, but my interest in the brain probably started about 10 years ago when all the newest research about, brain imaging and all the information that brought us, especially as it's connected to learning, so cognitive neuroscience. So I do want to kind of share, what happens in our brain when, we're in this pandemic and we're in quarantine and we have all these changes happen, so that we have a better understanding. We sort of know what's going on in our lives, but so that we have a better understanding of ourselves and how we can then pick strategies that will help our brains sort of survive and thrive during that time. So give me a sec. I'm just going to share my screen and then we will get started. Let me go into present mode. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So maybe just kind of where my head was at. When I, as teachers, of course, last year, we were kind of thrown into this new situation, thrown into lockdown, distance learning, all the changes, staying at home all the time, having my family home all the time. And one of the things that kind of struck me is as we're going through all these changes, what is really happening to our human brain? I, of course, had a basic understanding of, things happen in your brain. I know, there was lots of information about our mental health and what was going on. So it made me sort of dig deeper into what is physiologically going on. And then the other thing I sort of was introduced to probably for the first time, or my realization the first time in my life, is this idea of secondhand stress, and that when other people are having things going on in their brain, it can actually impact you as well. So that was really fascinating. And I started kind of doing the research. So what I want to do today is just give a basic understanding of how the brain works in a non-stressed environment, like what ideally is going on for our brains as adults, but also brains as children and our students. And then go on to what craziness happens when we're put under this load of stress. So really I'm not going to talk about like all the nitty gritties of the brain, but there are three main areas that are important to consider. The prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain is where all complex cognitive activity happens. So decision-making, planning, critical thinking, prioritizing, all of those kind of daily executive functions happen in your prefrontal cortex. So when you are at your job or you're making decisions at home or the kids are in class, their prefrontal cortex is like uber engaged with everything that's going on. The hippocampus, sort of towards the brain stem, is where memory happens. So when we are putting memories into short-term or long-term, or we're retrieving memories for connections and learning, it's going to happen in the hippocampus. And then finally, amygdala. All this information I teach my students in class, so they know this language and they can talk about their own brains. But the amygdala is where we have our emotional reactions. Together, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala are constantly communicating to each other back and forth. So if you're considering new ideas in your prefrontal cortex and you want to do learning, then those can be stored in short-term memory in the hippocampus. Then when you need to learn something else, you retrieve them from the hippocampus so that you can play with them again in your prefrontal cortex. All of that, every experience that we have is associated usually with an emotion. And all of those emotions are sort of stored in the hippocampus as well. So they work really well together in a non-stressed functioning brain. So the one thing that's really important to understand, when I first started teaching, there was this thinking that if kids didn't learn things by the time they were 14, that was it, they were done. No more learning was happening. And that had been passed down through research for years. And so as a teacher 20 years ago, there's this pressure like, oh no, we don't get to kids by the time they're 14, we can't give them all the tools they need. And then the recent, let's say, within the 20 years since I kind of began teaching, all of this new technology allowed for us to look inside the brain. And so what we discovered is this concept of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity basically says we learn for our entire lives. That whole theory is debunked and we learn. So what I want to do is show you this quick video about what neuroplasticity is, because it will play into an understanding of the rest of today's information.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
All right. So let me just kind of recap that as we were talking about neuroplasticity. And again, the reason that, even though it seems very scientific, this new science is being taught at lower and lower levels. So Harvard Education has a new program for mind-brain education, and educators are bringing it as low as like grade 1 and grade 2, so that kids have a better understanding of their own brain and they have more control. So just quickly in this diagram, oh my goodness. Just quickly in that diagram, I do want to talk about your axons, because that's where the information, the magic really happens. So in the axon, that's like your pathway. That's like where all the information passes from one neuron to another neuron. And your brain is made up of about 100 billion neurons. And so when you are thinking, when you are learning, when you are feeling, neurons are constantly connecting to each other. For neurons to connect, you're going to have the end of an axon called an axon terminal, which connects to a dendrite. And in order for those connections to happen, that's what neurotransmitters are. They just help those connections happen. And so on any given day, especially if we're thinking about our kids, the number of connections those neurons is making can be, like thousands a day. And it's constantly going back and forth as new information is put into your brain. And so the neurotransmitters, keeping those stable, are really important for thinking and learning. And we want to make sure we're really considering, are we keeping our neurons in our brain healthy so all that thinking and learning and feeling can continue? If you go to babies, the cool thing about babies is that they are born with too many neurons. So babies are born in their first day with like billions and billions and billions of neurons, but like 50 trillion synapses. A synapse is the connection, it's the learning connection. So when babies are born, they just have so much going on in their brain, which is often why their heads are bigger. And then they are learning, they're constantly learning, and those synapses are just happening like so rapidly. So they often say for learning, the brain does the most work in the first 2 years of life, where they're learning all their basic skills and recognition and language. But then the second largest time of growth is adolescence. So adolescents go through this cool growing process, and they have 500 trillion synapses or connections all the time. So even more than the first 2 years of life, the brain does more growing in their adolescence. So when you are thinking about when do I introduce my child to new information or to new learning, middle school is a fabulous time because their brains are so moldable. It's just waiting for those connections to happen. Now, the other part that happens to our brain is what is called synaptic pruning. So as we have more experiences and we practice more experiences, our brain will take away the neurons that are not being used. So it's like excess waste. In order to be more efficient, because the newborn was born with so many, there's just too many to be efficient in the brain. So in adolescence, the brain starts pruning those away, or just kind of taking them away to make sure that the axon connections are really efficient, that kids can learn what they really want to learn. What it does mean is that we don't want to narrow the experiences of our kids so that the brain prunes those opportunities away. So, we want to introduce music and to language and to, theater and to all different kinds of reading. Like we just want to make sure we're paying special attention to those synapses. Where pruning is good to a certain degree, we don't want to over prune. When those connections happen, another healthy brain action is called myelination. And I know it sounds fancy, but myelination is just fat and it wraps itself around the axon. And what it does is it protects it, it insulates it. It's kind of like plastic around a wire. It keeps it safe, but every time you make a connection or you make the same connection. So let's say a habit. Every time your habit is to think positive thoughts. Every time you think a positive thought, that connection gets myelin more and more and more, and it makes it more stable. It insulates it, so the speed of the connection is faster. So myelination, we need the myelination for that speed. There are disorders in the brain where there is very little myelination for whatever reason. And that can lead to things like muscular sclerosis and some other conditions. So we want to be thinking about how do I make sure my brain is healthy and those myelin or the myelination keeps happening. In the brain, when we talk about gray matter and we talk about white matter, gray matter are all your neurons and where all your electrical and chemical connections happen. The white matter is actually the fatty sheath or the protein of the myelin. So you always want to make sure that you have a healthy balance of myelin in your system. So what that means for you, just in a normal day, when you have a normal functioning, unstressed brain, your connections between neurons, especially those between the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, they're functioning normally, they're functioning efficiently, they're functioning fast, you have increased focus, you have increased energy, you don't have inflammation in your brain, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and you have this continued neuroplasticity. So the goal for your brain is to keep the connections going. So the pruning is under control and you're increasing your synapses. Keep your myelination, as functional as possible. And we will talk about that. And then the last part is this idea of microglia, which sounds, I know, very, very fancy and scientific. But again, you'll see this little cartoon, Rory the microglia. It's actually from a grade 2 book for teaching kids about who these little guys are. So in your brain, you've got your neurons, your axon, all that neuroplasticity is happening. You've got your white matter with the myelination. Now, in between everything, you have these little guys called, well, there's a whole bunch of different kinds, but they're glial cells. But this particular one, the microglia, is your immune system. And so what these little guys do is they just kind of are hanging out in your brain. They get rid of cell waste. They sort of eat it up. They're the ones that do the pruning to make sure that your brain can stay efficient, and it supports the neuroplasticity. If there's anything like bacterial or viral, you have a virus and it's in your brain, it's there to eat it up. So these are really important to our immune system. And so if we start thinking inside our brain, most people don't think that closely, but if we want to keep that brain health, we do want to know those particular pieces. So when this pandemic hit and we were stuck in quarantine, we were in this and could still be in this extended period of stress in response to quarantine. So while we're during this stress, and by no means is this exhaustive, this list, but we will have noticed that this stress included a decrease in social contact, of course, especially in like strict lockdown, a decrease in opportunities for alone time. So there's that like juxtaposition between needing social contact for healthy brain function, but also needing alone time for healthy brain function. And if we're with our family all the time, that reduces that. The reduction with environmental interactions, the reduction in opportunities to reinforce synapses because we aren't having novel experiences because we're just kind of like in our habits in our home. The reduction in sleep possibly. So in the time of stress and quarantine, or even now, those things are going down, while at the same time, our brain there's a higher demand for self-management, especially for our kids who are trying to do homeschooling, like trying to do the distance learning. The demand on them was exponential. The demand for emotional regulation. So our amygdala, it was just like loaded on with us trying to figure out emotionally how we deal with everything that's been going on. The demand for adaptive change. So we were expecting all of our students and children, all of our teachers, all of our parents to change really, really quickly. And that goes against what we would normally do. Our demand for new synaptic connections, while we want to keep them going, we were asking to do it quickly. Like we had to learn how to do a lot of new things, especially with distance learning, fast. We had increased consumption. So while we're at home, we're eating more, perhaps drinking more or smoking more, but whatever we were consuming, not everyone, of course, but that did increase. And of course, increased screen time. Be it because you're doing distance learning for kids, because you're in meetings for work and you're doing Zooms, just like we are now, but also watching TV, watching Netflix, being on our phones. We were trying to replace what kind of was taken away from us during, everything that's been going on in the past year. So our brain had all of these things to contend with at the same time. So when that happens, we're going to feel the stress of that happening. And when we feel stress, so this is our brain. Remember, we have our prefrontal cortex, we have our amygdala, and we have our hippocampus. Now, here's the thing about the human brain, and this is one piece of information I will take to my grave because it's so important. You take your information and whatever you're learning, whatever you're sensing comes through your 5 senses. So whatever you see, hear, feel, taste, that's how you get the information into your brain. All that information, for the most part, goes to a piece of your brain called the thalamus. It's like triage. You go to the hospital, triage figures out Where's the biggest threat? They take care of that first, and then everything else, is taken care of in time. For your brain, when new information comes in, the thalamus says, is this a threat? Is this not a threat? If it's not a threat, then it goes to your prefrontal cortex. You play with the ideas, you learn, you think. For kids, it means their brain is open to everything. They have to learn calculus or they have to learn to read. It means the brain is open for that. Now, if the thalamus says this information is a threat, if it's, someone yelling at them, if it's a test for kids, if it's being overwhelmed at work for adults, if it's, truly a threat, like if someone's attacking you, the information is sent to the amygdala. The amygdala says, survive, survive, preserve, survive. The amygdala shuts the entire brain down so that you can go into fight or flight mode. It's a beautiful thing. If you think about way back in the days of caveman, if a lion was coming at you, you want your brain to take over and protect you. The problem with that is that we don't always know what threats are. So for children, especially, because sometimes they have a voice, sometimes they don't recognize it, their triggers can come from anywhere. It can come from school. It can come from wearing the wrong pair of shoes at class. It could come from, a spelling test that they didn't study from. It could come from, for you, if you have a friend or you have a colleague that you perceive as toxic. Any of those triggers, what they might be, it tells the amygdala to go into hijack. And so everything else shuts down. So in order to protect ourselves, when we go into amygdala hijack, we produce a whole bunch of cortisol. And that cortisol, it messes the brain up, right? It just puts everything into like a crazy flux. And we want to find ways to kind of deal with that flux. Now, amygdala hijack, again, we don't always know what the triggers are. Some are obvious, some are not. When a trigger hits you, you have a physical response, kind of your mind and your body. In response, your body will reduce circulation and blood flow. So oxygen and blood flow will slow down so your body can survive. You're going to have specific chemical and electrical responses, which we'll touch on a little bit. So we consider that an acute stress response. And then we go into fight or flight, and cortisol is produced in our brains. Now, small moments of acute stress are good. They actually make you learn. So there's no problem with that. We're not saying you should live a stress-free life like in a hut on the beach, just relaxing, although that would be nice. What we are saying, if this continues over the course of a long time, let's say over a year, it becomes chronic stress. And our brain never has a chance to correct itself. We are just in this constant state of stress, whether we're aware of that or not aware of that. So in response to that, people have different ways of responding. Okay, sometimes it's fight. So, sometimes it's getting angry, it's yelling, it's throwing things. You slam doors. I know my daughter, I have a senior daughter. It usually ends up with some loud statement of protest and then a slammed door. Sometimes it's bullying. Bullying can be a stress response to whatever they're dealing with. Sometimes people go into flight mode. And flight mode is, how do I pull myself out of this stressful situation? Sometimes it's obsessive compulsive disorders because controlling something else takes you out of the stressful situations. Sometimes it's being a workaholic. Sometimes it is, just staying in your bedroom, like a lot of our kids do. Sometimes it's going quiet. Sometimes it's hiding. But we try and pull ourselves, fly away from the stress. Sometimes we freeze. It's paralysis. It's that, I don't know how many of you have felt that, but it's the paralysis of being so stressed out. So kind of spacing out, looking into like out the window and not moving, not having emotions. is a freeze response, like just going numb, having a brain fog where you can't do the thinking. It's like your whole body literally just freezes. And then fawning, which is one of the most unrecognized types of stress response, is the people pleasing. It's because you're trying to avoid conflict or any situation that will intensify the stress. You compliment everybody to make them feel good. You'll never kind of say your piece because it might bring on conflict. People might say you can be taken advantage of. And this happens a lot with kids. Like all of these versions of stress response I see in students. And so it's really important to think for you, one, who are you? Normally we're two. So you're either a fight and a flight, maybe a flight and a freeze. For me, I'm probably a flight and a freeze. I don't like conflict. It's hard for me to be kind of in your face. It's not my way because I'm always protecting my amygdala. So it's easier for me to sort of back away than to face head on. Where if you're a fight, you might face that head on. So what happens in that stress? So when the excessive cortisol happens, our myelin production gets all messed up. We actually produce too much. And while that should seem like a good thing because it helps all of our connections be really efficient, too much white matter in the brain actually kind of slows everything down and it makes it inefficient. So again, there are other conditions where you have too much myelin. And so again, the balance is out of whack. And then our connections. So think about it. Have you, during the course of this past year, been at home and then you walk into the kitchen and you can't remember kind of what you were doing? Or, maybe you were cooking something and you can't remember something. It's because your brain connections are physiologically slowed down because you have too much myelin in your brain. In addition, our little friends, the microglia that are there for immunity, that are protecting our brain, that are getting rid of all the waste and the threats, they actually get overactive, overstimulated, and then they start over pruning, and they are just getting too efficient almost. And so that balance again in our brain is all thrown off. And we just can't do the same kind of thinking because the pruning is happening where it shouldn't be happening. So what used to be, sorry. So what used to be a strong connection has now been reduced. By no means does it take it all away, but it definitely reduces it, which again would contribute to that sort of brain fog. Excuse me. Brain fog. Or that just slower thinking. Not to mention, on top of that, when we're stressed, because of the lack of social contact, we often have reduced access to natural environments. And natural environments or being in nature have shown through brain studies and brain imaging to increase positive activity in your amygdala. So it keeps your amygdala calm when you're outside. What we haven't thought about is how we have a lack of social hierarchies. We live our life within these hierarchies. So students come to school and they're dependent on teachers to kind of help them through it. Teachers come to school and they're sort of dependent on admin to get them through of it. We go to jobs and there are people there who sort of help us through. So while we are independent, we have this sort of subconscious knowledge of the hierarchy that helps us. And that's important because it helps us focus our energy on what's important and use our time efficiently. And it's something that's really helpful in our society, like it's how our society is set up. But that kind of goes when you're at home and have to do it all on your own, especially for kids with distance learning. Again, we have reduced opportunities for alone time, which we need to regenerate. Being with people is very exhaustive. So we have to our brain needs to kind of rest from that. Interestingly, when we don't have the social contact gives us dopamine rush. That's why we're such a social species, because it produces a neurotransmitter. So remember that in order for us to, our neuroplasticity, for all those neurons to connect, for us to learn, we need dopamine. But when it's reduced, those connections aren't happening at the same speed. We have reduced oxytocin, which is known sort of as the hug hormone. So when you feel love, when you feel connection, it puts a hormone that keeps everything in your brain regulated. You have reduced serotonin. Again, another neurotrans, excuse me, oh my goodness, needed for synaptic processes. And that is regulated to your appetite, cognition, memory, sleep, digestion, like everything. And that's reduced. And then, of course, because you're not really outside, you're not seeing the sun necessarily in full lockdown, you have reduced vitamin D. So not only do these apply to stresses during quarantine, but you can also consider them for life, right? Like even now when everything seems open, do we still have some of these same stresses that are impacting how our brain functions? So what do we want to be thinking about when we are thinking about supporting our brain function? Well, the very cool thing, because of neuroplasticity, is that nothing is permanent. Is that while this might happen in times of chronic stress, we have this beautiful, like our brain is amazing, that we can get it all back. And we can make it better if we're being intentional in protecting our brain. So number one, and this is, if you take nothing away from me today, take this. Your amygdala must be protected like it's a newborn baby. Is that because we know it controls everything. We want to keep it happy and we want to keep it calm. Many of these, I'm sure you've heard of them, but I want to connect them to the brain. So mindfulness, what happens with mindfulness, because of your focus, because your prefrontal cortex, everything is sort of shut down while your amygdala is kind of spinning out of control. Mindfulness is you paying attention to your brain and refocusing. So as the amygdala relaxes with the refocus of mindfulness, the hippocampus becomes more active. So you're able to access memories of a time when you weren't stressed out and do it, or memories of a strategy that worked when you weren't stressed out. And then you can start controlling it. Controlled breathing refocuses signals to reactivate your prefrontal cortex. So that breathing in and breathing out keeps your amygdala calm and it opens up your prefrontal cortex. Soothing scents. For those of you who know me, I have a candle in my classroom, always. And when the kids walk into my classroom, they immediately tell me how calm they are. And that's because, and this is a very cool thing, we talked about the thalamus and how the thalamus decides if it's a threat or not a threat. And then it decides, do I shut down does my amygdala shut down everything, or am I okay? Smells are the only sense that bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to your amygdala. So even in stress, you're like, if a smell is there, or like you could have lavender in your hands, as soon as you smell it, it calms the amygdala without your thalamus or anybody having a say in the matter. So always having those calming scents around constantly keeps your amygdala calm. Identifying your triggers. When you are in a state of calm, if you can name your trigger, you can tame your trigger. And so when your amygdala is starting to shut down, you try and refocus on, oh, wait, that was my trigger. What have I done in the past? How do I find the neural connection of what I've done before? And I'm going to strengthen it. And then then the last one, as I mentioned, what is your stress response? Are you a fight and flight? Are you a flight and freeze? Like being aware of that response, we can recognize it in ourselves ahead of time, and then we're in a better place to deal with it. Two, as we mentioned, when the cortisol and everything hits, when the microglia sort of get out of whack, when the cortisol is raised, when there's an increased production of myelin, it creates inflammation in the brain. If you have, lots of studies have been done now, and I think there's consensus that when you are depressed, it is caused by inflammation in the brain because of all these factors that are going on. So what you want to be doing is thinking about, how do I reduce inflammation in the brain? And I know we don't think about that often, kind of explicitly, but I think we should. So lifestyle changes are definitely really important. Dairy consumption, you don't have to get rid of all of it, but you might want to consider, how do I reduce it? Sugar, I often say, especially to my own children, sugar is like cocaine, right? It impacts the same part of your brain as narcotics, but we don't pay attention to that. So reducing your sugar intake reduces the inflammation in your brain. Smoking and alcohol, because they are chemical toxins, they increase inflammation in the brain, so reducing them will help. Increasing your oxygen flow helps the efficiency in your brain, which reduces inflammation. And then interestingly, in my research, I had found this anti-inflammatory food pyramid that was put together with a focus on what are superfoods to help reduce the inflammation in my brain. So there's this kind of pyramid put together about what I might want to include in my diet. By no means do you have all of this, but it's just thinking about, is my diet varied enough to help reduce inflammation? Now, you notice kind of on the tip of that pyramid is dark chocolate. So whenever I want to have my little treat, that keeps me going, oh, it's good for my brain. Also notice red wine at the top there, but you can't go overboard. More is not better. But let's look at the bottom, which is where we want to focus our brain food. Lots of vegetables, especially colorful vegetables, berries have a lot of those antioxidants. Thinking about anything that's close to nature and natural is going to help your brain. So I just thought that was interesting to share this kind of pyramid on how we reduce inflammation, and it helps you kind of think about, what is my diet like? And then, of course, being really intentional about increasing opportunities for synaptic connections. So thinking, my brain is plastic and it's learning all the time, and I want like my neurons to connect with each other. How do I do that? One, as an adult, kids are a little bit different, but as an adult, a big chunk of your synaptic connections will happen within your hippocampus, or with an active hippocampus. And your hippocampus, again, is memory. So anytime you have to learn or memorize new information or new skills, then you start creating new neural pathways. Commit to the narrative. I love this, being an English teacher. Reading books, our brain needs narratives because we're constantly looking for patterns. That's how our brain works, like the thinking. We assimilate new information into old information, and narratives give us that option. I would push you to go outside your comfort zone, because it will push your neural connections further. We're looking to make new ones as well as strengthening old ones. Seek novelty. Anything new is new learning. So try and push yourself outside of your regular, even if it's one thing a week, that will increase your synaptic connections. And then also seek repetition. Remember, we talked about myelin. So myelin basically, it just gets more and more and stronger and insulates more the more you do something. So for those good habits, try and repeat them to increase your myelin production. For bad habits, when you try and change the habit, it will reduce the myelin insulation of that axon, and then hopefully that will change. And for us in this quarantine phase, the more we can return to old habits, the habits that we liked, the things that we did every day, then you're just reinforcing the myelination of your connections. So just going back, increase your access to natural environments, return to your daily habits, seek out downtime, increase healthy dopamine. So thinking about, where do I get my feel-goodness from? Try and stay away from food or drinks or smoking or anything that's toxic, but go looking for good opportunities for the happiness drug. Hug your kids, increase that oxytocin, Sometimes I do this in the hallway with my senior. She says she doesn't like it, but I think she likes it. Increase serotonin, exercise, bright light, the sun will increase serotonin, sleep, a clean diet. All of those things will rebuild that neurotransmitter. And then increase your vitamin D. So, you know, we all want to get it, and especially in Dubai, we can get our daily dose of sun, but be intentional about that to keep your brain function healthy. So my final note, you know, that was a lot. I know it was a lot, and I don't need you to take all of it away, but I just want you to be aware that our brains, there's so many things going on. We need to protect them. We need to love our brains. We need to picture them as our children and protect them the same way we would protect our, you know, little breathing animals. And always consider first your amygdala. Keep it safe, love your amygdala, and then everything else will work. All right. I've got maybe a couple minutes left, open to any questions that you may have, any ideas you want to share. I'll see if I can answer them. If I can't, I'll make sure that I find a way to get answers when it comes to the brain. If you don't have any questions now, that's absolutely fine. I am always free to talk about the brain. I do have some parents who guys want to chat about all things the brain, and they're really interested, and that's my favorite kind of conversation. So you can always just contact me on your own, and we can talk all things. Thanks, Natalie. You know what, the fascinating thing in my fascination is, you know, it absolutely as an educator helps me with children, but almost more importantly, it helps me as a mother. And so you know, when I give this information, absolutely it's about your children, but I think it's for us too. We need kind of this self-care as well. So thank you for saying that. Oh, so my scent in my classroom, and actually, I'll take any recommendations from you. Right now, I have Bath and Body Works, and it's the warm vanilla sugar. So for me, that vanilla cooking, baking smell, it's very calm, and this is the one that the kids respond to. If for some reason, there's always some sort of element of vanilla to it, but I also am aware some people don't like vanilla. I would stay away from anything too pungent because sometimes that doesn't calm your amygdala. So it's like, you know, lavender, that's why they say lavender is good for sleep. The physiological piece of it is because it's calming your amygdala. But so my request is, I was trying to make my own candles from soy wax, and I was trying to get scents from the US because I can't find them here in Dubai to make my own candles, so they were more sustainable, but I haven't been able to find the right supplies yet. So my kids know I'm working on this project to do it. So if anyone knows any really great supply places for candles and scents, I would love that information. In ticks, in terms of their behaviors, definitely it's calming down a little bit now, but at the beginning of the year, I saw increased like fidgeting. It was very hard for them to settle. It was very hard for them to pay attention to the screen or the board. Like on the table, right? If you have your hand like on the table, I did see that. Now, the beginning of the year was very stressful for kids. Now, and imagine this. Imagine not only do you have everything that's going on in your brain from all these changes that are going outside the school, then they're coming to school and being expected to learn. So their stress was double. So I was very cognizant to that. They also came into school at the beginning of the year scared. So we had our masks on, we were distanced. They didn't know if they could talk to each other. They didn't know how to connect socially. They certainly couldn't hug each other. But now I think kids have eased up. Although we did just get that email about how we have to reinforce our social distancing with kids. But in the beginning I did, but I do see it's calmer now, absolutely. You know what? I do believe that the question was, do you believe in prayer and faith? If you think about the function of prayer, right? Really what you're doing is you're committing to a focus on something you believe in. It's exactly the same as mindfulness. Your brain and the energies of your brain are focused on something you believe. And belief should, I believe, make you feel really good about yourself, make you feel good about your environment, make you feel good about your relationships. So now I did read a short study. I haven't gone into depth about the connection between like faith, belief, prayer in your brain. It's still a work in progress. There are people who are trying to make those explicit connections, but it would make sense, right? Like if your focus, if your brain, if your amygdala is calmed by your belief in something and by your faith, then that's a beautiful thing. And I would hope that, I often say this to the kids, is that whatever your belief system is, you know, believe in it fully so that you feel good about yourself as a person. And that will always calm your amygdala. That's a great question, actually. I should do some more study on that. Mindfulness, the question was, you know, what do I mean by mindfulness? So mindfulness, whatever it might look like for you, is a time where you're centered. You're trying to, if we go back to the brain, right? All your information comes in through your five senses. And then your thalamus is there as a triage. So your goal is, how do I reduce the influx of my five senses and the information flowing into my brain? How do I reduce that so I can just focus on one thing, that my brain isn't focusing on identifying threats? If you take those moments to practice gratitude, like, you know how you have those gratitude journals. If you're sitting down and you're solely focused on what you're grateful for, you're ignoring those outside senses and those threats. It could be meditation, right? So I can practice meditation. Right now, you can't tell I'm in my book room, but there's couches. So in those moments of the day, I do come in here, close my eyes, and I will focus that. And it doesn't have to be long. It's only a couple minutes. It's just that downtime. Meditation could be like chanting. The chanting, it's the same thing. It's making sure the information coming in from five senses is reduced. You know, the one thing that actually I find too is when I go to the gym, it's like flow. If you've heard of that concept of flow, where you're so focused on one thing, nothing else exists. When I'm in the gym and I'm pushing weights and it's quite heavy, so my brain can only focus on controlling that weight, for me, that's like mindfulness, because all my other senses are gone. I'm not paying attention to the guy across the way. I'm not paying attention to the noises. You know what? Here's another one as well, because I do this a lot. And I tell the kids in class to do this. Music. So in my class, on YouTube, you can search meditation music or you can search brain music. And the kids listen to it while they're working. And you would be amazed how quiet it is because they're just calm. But it needs to be non-lyric music, because lyrics, your brain will automatically go to process like phonetic processing, which, you know, it's too active. But non-lyric music, sort of that, you know, like listening to the like Buddha chants, or the I have this great tape and it's like Indian like bells. Oh, I can't remember what it's called. It's lovely. My husband loves it too. Anything that's non-lyric focused, so you don't activate your phonetic processing, that will keep you calm, and that can be a form of mindfulness. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I love talking about this stuff. So again, my door is always, always, always open. If you want any book recommendations, I do have, I don't know if you have access to this PowerPoint, but maybe just at the beginning or at the end of my PowerPoint, I do have a list. Actually, maybe I'll just put it on the screen right now. I do have a list of all of my resources to support the information I have. So it's all cited there. So you could have a quick look at those titles by reviewing this video again. But you may also just send me a quick message and I can recommend any like books or information, and I can find you resources if you wanted to talk more about that.